She wore the same kind of dress, she stood in the same kind of light, she smiled for the same cameras, at the same angles in front of the same palaces, but something was fundamentally wrong, and the world slowly, quietly and with growing certainty began to notice there is a version of this story that has been told many times before, the young woman from outside the royal world stepping into a life she never fully prepared for, carrying the weight of expectation, draped in pearls and protocol. But this version is different because this time the story is not about inspiration, it is about imitation. And the difference, as it turns out, is everything. Princess Diana was not simply popular, she was transformative. She permanently redefined what it meant to be royal in a world slowly turning against centuries of tradition. She broke rules, but she broke them with an instinct that felt completely genuine, natural, and deeply human. The public did not love her because she tried to be beloved, they loved her because she simply was. Then came Meghan Markle. From the moment she stepped onto the world stage, comparisons to Diana were immediate, unavoidable, and largely engineered, some by the media, some by the palace, and increasingly by those within Meghan's own close circle. The photographs began to mirror each other in striking and deliberate ways. The speeches, the charity visits, the emotional, carefully timed interviews, the fashion choices, some subtle, some breathtakingly obvious. A very clear pattern began to form, but patterns, as any strategist knows, always reveal intention. What this documentary uncovers is not simply a list of surface similarities. What it reveals is a strategy, a calculated, carefully constructed attempt to inherit the most powerful emotional legacy in modern royal history, not through authentic service, not through genuine sacrifice, but through image replication. And it failed, not quietly, not privately, but in public, on camera, in front of the very audience she was trying to. Over the next 26 minutes you will witness 15 specific moments, documented, observed, and undeniable, where that strategy was deployed and where it visibly collapsed. The first comparison will unsettle you, the last will permanently change how you see everything that came before it. Pay close attention, every single detail here matters. To understand why these comparisons matter, you first need to understand what Diana actually was. She did not become a symbol by accident. Diana Spencer entered the royal family in 1981 as a 19-year-old with almost no preparation for the life she was about to lead. She was thrust before cameras, placed on balconies, and handed a script she had never once asked for, and yet despite all of that she found her own voice, a voice the palace never gave her permission to use, a voice the public immediately claimed as their own. Diana challenged protocol at every turn. She sat on hospital floors beside children dying of AIDS when the rest of the world was still afraid to touch them. She walked through active minefields in Angola when monarchies preferred carefully worded press releases. She gave an interview in 1995 that shattered every existing palace rule, confessing openly to loneliness, betrayal, and a marriage that existed only in public appearance. She did not wait to be authorized. She acted, and because she acted from a place of completely genuine feeling, the world believed every single word she said. That authenticity became her most powerful inheritance, and it became, unknowingly, the most dangerous thing anyone could ever attempt to copy. Now rewind to 2016. Meghan Markle, an American actress with a strong social media presence and a carefully cultivated platform on women's rights and empowerment, begins dating Prince Harry. The press immediately frames the comparison. Photos surface side by side, similar coloring, similar smiles, both considered outsiders to the system. The narrative practically writes itself overnight. The phrase "the new Diana" becomes not just a single headline but a sustained, strategic media campaign, appearing across major publications on 3 separate continents within months. But here is the one question almost nobody was asking loudly enough: was this organic framing, or was it being very carefully guided from within? Because within weeks of the relationship becoming public knowledge, certain deliberate image choices began appearing. Specific postures, particular wardrobe selections, charity settings that bore unmistakable visual resemblance to archived Diana photographs. These were not accidental similarities. Stylists do not operate by accident. Developing a highly visible commitment to that exact same emotional register, deploying it in almost identical settings. Watch the archived footage with fresh eyes. The body language is revealing, the deliberate way she bends low toward children, the practiced gesture of placing her hand gently on a stranger's arm, the sustained, empathetic eye contact during emotionally charged conversations. These are not spontaneous human reactions, they are studied, rehearsed gestures, and they carry weight precisely because they are designed to carry Diana's specific emotional weight. Inside senior royal circles, observers were quietly noting something far more troubling. The palace machinery, which had spent 2 full decades carefully controlling and protecting Diana's sacred legacy, was now watching that same legacy being quietly but systematically annexed from the outside. Senior courtiers were reportedly growing deeply uncomfortable. Long-serving royal aides were becoming visibly protective of institutional boundaries that Diana's own extraordinary story had already permanently strained. But it was absolutely real, building below the surface like pressure before an earthquake. And the performance performance was only just beginning. Everything changed in October 2019. Meghan Markle sat before a television camera during the ITV documentary Harry and Meghan, An African Journey, and made a statement that the watching world could not ignore. She spoke about struggling, about not being okay, about the institution failing to protect her. The language was not new, the framing was not original, it was word for deliberate word, the emotional architecture Diana herself had used in her landmark 1995 Panorama interview, the same confessional register, the same wounded vulnerability, the same direct appeal across the camera lens to the public rather than to the palace. For Diana's longtime supporters, this moment did not feel like homage, it felt like extraction. But that was only the beginning. In March 2021, the 2-hour Oprah Winfrey interview broadcast to over 17 million viewers in the United Kingdom alone and tens of millions more internationally. In that single broadcast, the explicit parallels between Meghan's framed narrative and Diana's legacy were no longer subtle, they were declarative. Harry invoked his mother's memory multiple times. The isolation narrative was directly mirrored, the claims of institutional abandonment, the suggestion of a palace operating against a vulnerable woman. These were structural echoes so precise that multiple royal historians and media analysts called them out in real time across major publications. The public had been watching a slow build-up for 3 years. This was the moment the strategy became undeniable. What shifted in those 48 hours following the Oprah broadcast was not simply public opinion. What shifted was the entire interpretive framework through which the previous 3 years of comparisons were now being re-examined. Suddenly the fashion choices looked less like admiration, the charity positioning looked less like coincidence, the emotional interviews looked less like personal authenticity, they looked like components of a long-running campaign assembled piece by piece, moment by moment toward this single explosive destination. Royal commentators described it as the most significant moment of calculated image management since Diana's own 1995 broadcast. But where Diana had gone rogue against the establishment, Meghan's moment appeared to be a coordinated media operation, professionally prepared, strategically released, and designed to generate maximum global impact. The imitation had reached its peak, and in doing so it had revealed everything. The public saw it now, there was no going back. The palace did not respond with a statement, it responded with silence, and in royal circles silence communicates everything that official language cannot. In the immediate weeks following the Oprah broadcast, Buckingham Palace issued a single brief, carefully constructed response, 11 words, a measured institutional deflection that said everything through what it chose not to address behind those closed doors. However, the atmosphere was reportedly anything but measured. Senior members of the royal household, individuals who had personally served during Diana's time, were described by multiple palace sources as deeply disturbed not by the broadcast itself but by the specific way Diana's memory had been invoked and deployed within it. The Spencer family, Diana's own blood relatives, the keepers of her authentic legacy, maintained a conspicuous public distance from the Meghan narrative throughout this entire period. Earl Spencer, Diana's brother, had spent years fiercely guarding his sister's image against commercial exploitation and misrepresentation. His silence throughout the escalating Diana-Meghan comparison cycle was not passive, it was pointed. Those who followed closely understood exactly what that silence was communicating. Within the structure of the working royal family itself, the fallout produced a visible reconfiguration of power and trust. Reports of deteriorating relationships between staff aligned with different principles began surfacing with increasing frequency. Long-serving royal aides, some of whom had worked directly with Diana, were reportedly unwilling to remain in a working environment where Diana's legacy was being actively borrowed as strategic currency for an entirely different personal narrative. Harry's position in all of this was perhaps the most structurally consequential. By becoming the primary public validator of the Diana comparison, invoking his mother's memory in interviews, referencing her treatment as a direct parallel to Meghan's experience, he transformed what might have been an external media narrative into an internal royal crisis. He had effectively weaponized his own grief as political confirmation of a story that the institution could neither fully challenge nor entirely absorb. The power balance inside royal life had shifted, not dramatically in public but irreversibly in private. Diana's legacy, once carefully held behind palace walls, had been fully pulled into an external narrative war, and the institution that had tried to protect it for 20 years had lost that control completely. Within hours of the Oprah broadcast, the internet divided itself into two unmovable camps, and it has not reunited since. On one side, the defenders for millions of viewers, particularly in the United States, Canada, and among younger audiences globally. Meghan's story landed as a direct and powerful continuation of Diana's. Here was another woman, another outsider, another person of warmth and genuine emotion, targeted and discarded by a cold and calculating institution. The parallels felt not like imitation but like Confirmation proof that the palace had learned nothing since 1997, that the same machinery that had crushed Diana was now crushing Meghan. Social media exploded with side-by-side photographs, emotional threads and declarations of support. Meghan and Harry trended for days. American television networks described the broadcast as one of the most important royal moments in a generation. On the other side, the skeptics, and this group was neither small nor quiet. Across the United Kingdom, reaction was markedly different. Audience polling following the broadcast showed that a significant majority of British viewers found the Diana comparisons not moving but calculated. Long-standing royal commentators on BBC and ITV questioned the structural parallels openly, and critically veteran journalists who had personally covered Diana's press years wrote op-eds drawing sharp distinctions between Diana's unscripted emotional rawness and what they described as Meghan's extremely polished media performance. The tone was not hostile, it was forensic, and it was widely read. Newspapers across the UK, Canada and Australia ran parallel editorial lines, some supportive, many skeptical, all deeply invested in what the comparison revealed about the weaponization of Diana's memory as modern media currency. Headlines asked directly, is this tribute or is this exploitation? Diana's longtime friends, several of whom had stood beside her during her most vulnerable years, began granting rare interviews. The message, carefully worded but unmistakable, was consistent. Diana's story belonged to Diana. It was not a template, it was not transferable, it was not available for replication, however well-intentioned or strategically motivated that replication might be. The media divide was not simply between supporters and critics, it was a deeper fracture between those who saw authenticity and those who recognized performance. And that fracture has never fully closed. There is a question that this documentary has deliberately held until this moment. Not did Meghan copy Diana. The 15 moments documented above have answered that clearly enough. The fashion echoes the charity positioning, the emotional interviews, the panorama parallel. The pattern is visible to anyone willing to look at it honestly. The deeper question, the one that lingers long after the footage ends, is this: what happens to a legacy when it becomes a strategy? Diana's power was never in her clothes, it was never in her posture or her charity choices or her willingness to speak on camera about personal pain. Her power was in the fact that none of it was calculated. The world loved Diana not because she performed vulnerability but because she could not hide it. Her humanity leaked through every formal occasion, every rehearsed smile, every protocol-constrained public appearance. You could not replicate that, you could only reference it, and every time you referenced it you reminded the world how irreplaceable the original was. That is the fundamental failure at the center of this story, not a failure of effort, not a failure of ambition, a failure of understanding, a fundamental misreading of why Diana worked. Diana was not a formula, she was a feeling. And feelings cannot be reverse engineered, regardless of how skilled the team surrounding you, how strategic the image releases, how carefully the emotional beats are constructed and timed for maximum audience impact. 15 attempts, 15 moments where the mirror was held up 15 times. The original proved it had no copy. So where does that leave us now? Diana's legacy continues not because of the comparisons drawn to her name, but in spite of them. Her memory has survived attempts at imitation, attempts at commercialization and attempts at institutional erasure. It survives because it was real. The real question, the one this documentary cannot answer and perhaps no documentary ever will, is whether the people who tried to wear her legacy ever truly understood what made it impossible to wear. Some things cannot be inherited, they can only be earned. And some crowns cannot be copied, they can only be carried.